At first, the silence felt like distance. Not dramatic silence, just absence. No reassurance, no redirection, no sense of God intervening. She prayed, and nothing responded. She waited, and nothing shifted. And slowly, she began to interpret the quiet. She assumed silence meant disapproval, or delay, or worse, indifference, because silence leaves room for interpretation, and the human heart fills that space quickly. She told herself stories. God must be waiting for me to change. Maybe I missed something. Maybe this isn't meant for me after all. Silence became a verdict, not spoken, but assumed. She noticed how easily she translated quiet into rejection, because silence feels personal when we are already tired. It feels intentional when we are already unsure, and the longer it lasted, the heavier it became. She kept doing the right things, kept praying, kept staying faithful. But inside, she had begun to draw conclusions. She didn't stop believing in God. She stopped expecting response. She lowered her voice in prayer, lowered her hope, lowered her openness, because unanswered faith hurts more than distant faith. Silence had taught her to protect herself. She assumed God had moved on to something else, someone else. She thought maybe the season was meant to fade quietly. No ending, no explanation, just quiet closure. But what she didn't realize yet was this: silence is not absence, and it is not rejection. Sometimes silence is restraint. Sometimes it is patience. Sometimes it is God refusing to interrupt a deeper work. But when we misread silence, we respond to something God never said, and that misunderstanding shapes everything that follows. She didn't realize it then, but her greatest struggle was not God's silence, it was the meaning she attached to it. If you are in a season where God feels quiet, where prayer feels unanswered, where faith feels like speaking into still air, stay. This message is for the woman who misread God's silence and almost let that misunderstanding rewrite her faith. And if these words already feel uncomfortably familiar, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but so your heart always has a place to return when God feels quiet and faith begins to assume the worst. Now, let's talk about how that misunderstanding began and why silence is rarely what we think it is. Silence rarely feels neutral, especially when the heart is already tired. When she had strength, she could wait. When she had clarity, she could trust. But silence arrived when she had neither, and that made it feel personal. She realized that silence is hardest to bear when it follows faithfulness. If she had been distant, the quiet would have made sense. If she had ignored God, the absence would have felt deserved. But she hadn't. She had stayed. She had prayed. She had obeyed, even when it cost her. So silence felt unfair. It felt like being overlooked. She didn't accuse God out loud, but inwardly she wondered why faithfulness had not been acknowledged, why obedience had not been answered. And that is where silence began to sound like rejection. Not because God had withdrawn, but because expectation had formed. She had not expected reward, but she had expected response. A sense of direction, a word of reassurance, some indication that she was not alone in this. When none came, the mind stepped in. Because the human heart does not sit idly with ambiguity. It interprets. It connects dots that may not belong together. Silence became confirmation of her hidden fears. Maybe God is disappointed. Maybe I misunderstood the calling. Maybe I stayed longer than I should have. Silence did not say these things. Fear did. But fear is persuasive. When God is quiet, she began to see how much she associated God's presence with response, with movement, with reassurance, with clarity. When those disappeared, she assumed presence had too. But silence does not mean distance. It often means depth. God does not always respond when we expect him to, especially when responding would interrupt what he is forming. She did not yet see that. All she could feel was the ache of being unheard. And that ache slowly reshaped how she related to God. She prayed more carefully, trusted more cautiously, hoped more quietly, not because she stopped believing, but because she was trying not to be hurt by silence again. And that is how silence, when misunderstood, can quietly erode trust, not through rebellion, but through self-protection. Silence did not remain empty for long. The mind does not tolerate unanswered space, so it began to fill it, not with facts, with meaning. She noticed how quickly she started narrating the silence, not consciously, instinctively. If God wanted this, he would speak. If I were aligned, something would move. If I mattered here, I would feel his presence. None of these thoughts came from rebellion. They came from trying to make sense of waiting. Silence felt unbearable, unless it was explained, so she explained it. She began to assume that silence was intentional distance, that God was withholding, that she had misunderstood something, that she was meant to draw conclusions from what was not being said. And slowly, silence turned into a message. Not one God spoke, but one she inferred. This is where faith becomes vulnerable. Because when God is quiet, the loudest voice is often our own fear. Fear dresses itself as logic. It says, I'm just being realistic. I'm reading the signs. I'm protecting myself. But fear cannot interpret silence accurately. It always assumes loss. She realized that her conclusions were shaped by exhaustion, not revelation, by disappointment, not direction. But because the story made sense, she believed it. Silence became proof that nothing was happening, that staying was pointless, that hope was naive, that trust had been misplaced. She didn't stop believing in God. She stopped believing he was active in this place. And that belief changed everything. She prayed less expectantly, listened less attentively, stayed faithful, but from a guarded distance, because once silence becomes a story, we begin responding to the story, not to God. And that story can quietly reshape our faith. It can turn waiting into resignation, trust into caution, faithfulness into endurance. She didn't realize yet that God had not been silent because he was absent. He was silent because he was doing something that could not be narrated yet. But until she understood that, the story she told herself continued to shape how she stayed. While she was interpreting silence, God was working quietly, not in ways she could measure, not in ways she could narrate, but in ways that required time more than explanation. God was not ignoring her prayers. He was deepening them. Some answers cannot be given quickly because they would be misunderstood. Some direction cannot be offered early because it would short-circuit formation. She realized later that God's silence had not been emptiness. It had been restraint. Restraint from rushing her out of a season before it finished its work. Restraint from offering reassurance that would have replaced trust. Restraint from intervening in ways that would have kept her dependent on response instead of relationship. God was teaching her how to remain without feedback, how to trust without reinforcement, how to obey without emotional return. These lessons do not come through answers. They come through staying. While she waited, God was strengthening her inner stability. He was loosening her dependence on outcomes, quietly shifting her faith from reaction to conviction. She did not feel this happening. That is why she misread the silence, because the most important work rarely announces itself. God was forming endurance that would not collapse. When circumstances changed, discernment that would not panic. When clarity was delayed, trust that would remain, even when God chose not to explain himself. Silence had been the environment for this kind of growth. She realized something later that she could not see then. If God had spoken sooner, she would have leaned on the words instead of learning to listen. If God had intervened quickly, she would have depended on relief instead of developing trust. Silence was not punishment. It was protection. Protection from premature understanding. Protection from shallow confidence. Protection from mistaking information for intimacy. God was not absent in the quiet. He was careful. And that care was shaping her more deeply than constant reassurance ever could. Understanding did not come suddenly. There was no moment of revelation, no verse that suddenly explained everything, no emotional release that made sense of the waiting. Understanding came quietly. It came as she stopped fighting the silence. She realized that silence had not been asking her to leave, to assume, or to protect herself. It had been asking her to remain attentive. God had not been withholding words because she was failing. He had been withholding words because she was learning to listen without needing confirmation. She saw that silence had exposed how much she relied on reassurance to feel secure, how quickly she needed feedback to trust her steps, and God was gently removing that dependence, not to make her uncertain, but to make her grounded. She began to notice that her faith no longer rose and fell with God's responses. She trusted without urgency, prayed without demand, stayed without conditions. Silence stopped feeling like rejection. It began to feel like space where God was working, without interruption, space where faith could deepen, without distraction, space where trust was no longer reactive. She realized that silence had been a form of guidance, not telling her where to go, but teaching her how to stay. And that understanding changed how she walked forward. She no longer rushed God for clarity, no longer assumed distance. When nothing was said, no longer filled quiet with fear-driven meaning. She learned to wait without narrating, to stay without interpreting, to trust without explanation. She misread God's silence completely. She thought it meant rejection, distance, disinterest. But silence had never been absence. It had been intention. God was not ignoring her faith. He was strengthening it, not by speaking more, but by teaching her to remain steady when nothing was said. If you are in a season where God feels quiet, where prayers feel unanswered, where faith feels like staying without feedback, let this be your reminder. Silence is not God stepping away. It is often God trusting you with deeper growth. You are not being overlooked. You are being formed. And what God is forming in the quiet will hold you when life becomes loud again. If you want a place to return when silence tempts you to assume the worst, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but for your journey, because the God who is quiet now is still present, still working, and still faithful.